in the West. Indeed, one only need look at current and historical demographic trends to see that the appeal of democracy is certainly not limited to the West. It is said that people tend to vote with their feet. Looking back at the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the West in the Cold War, we must ask ourselves, which side felt the need to build the Berlin Wall, and which side was it that finally knocked it down? It doesn't need me to tell you whether it is North or South Korea that shoots or imprisons those of its citizens that want to get out, and whether it is North or South Korea that offers refuge and support to those citizens of the other side who manage to get in. If it were up to you, where would you rather live? Burma or Botswana? Uzbekistan or Uruguay? India or Iran? It is nothing short of pure selfishness, even tribalism, to argue against the support of democratic movements in countries that don't respect human rights and the rule of law, simply because we live in a country that does. Why should the people of some countries be entitled to certain rights, while people from other countries should not? Those who argue that it is simply how those people have chosen to live delude themselves. Do you really believe the Tutsis in Rwanda were content with their government in 1994, or elsewhere in that very same year, that the Muslim population of Srebrenica actually enjoyed the atrocities that were visited upon them by their ethnic Serbian overlords? You know, we promote democracy because it is essential for those countries' stability, it's essential for those countries' development process in today's world, and indeed in the name of progress, because guess what? Democracy is progress compared to tyranny. And I suppose that if you were to sum up why we believe in imposing democracy, I think the phrase we would use is the responsibility to protect. That as fellow members of the human race, our responsibility to each other should supersede those parochial affiliations as members of a particular nation state, citizens of which we often find ourselves by nothing more than an accident of birth or of good fortune. The recognition of the fact that this responsibility is indeed a worthy aspiration, that the words "never again," coined after the atrocities of the 20th century, should be more than just words, has recently led to this doctrine, the doctrine of responsibility to protect, becoming officially incorporated into the ever-evolving corpus of international law. Adopted in 2006 by the UN Security Council, this doctrine of responsibility to protect mandates imposition of our universal values into a sovereign state to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. In the event that that state has proven, or, it is also crucial, is likely to prove unwilling or incapable of taking the necessary action itself to protect its citizens' human rights. And we support this because by far and away the greatest threat to human rights today is posed not by international conflict, the type that were commonplace in the 20th century, but by intra-national ones, often in fact by citizens' own leaders. This point is too often forgotten in debates on this subject of intervention and imposition. And unfortunately, too often, the legal system internationally has proved itself incapable of dealing with the problem either. To give you an idea of the scale of the problem that we're talking about here, in the last decade of the 20th century, 79 of the 82 conflicts on the African continent were intra-national as opposed to international. A ratio that remains largely unaltered as the first decade of the 21st century draws to a close. And because of the changing nature of the international system, we are arguing tonight that there has to be a changing nature in terms of how we respond as well. And the ramifications of this shift in human terms is equally profound. Whereas at the start of the 20th century, 15% of casualties in conflict were civilian, as the new millennium dawned, that figure had skyrocketed to 90%, 90. The vast majority of casualties in today's conflict are people unable to fight back, who find themselves in that position not because of what any external power has done, but because their own leaders have proved either unwilling or unable to act in their defence. So in this particular case, and I want to highlight the responsibility to protect case, imposition by force indeed may be required, and indeed should be required, in order to arrest the decline of human rights and democratic rights. The excesses of leaders set upon a course of action that not only deprives their citizens of democratic rights, but frequently of the right to life itself. And I think again, at this point, pause for a moment just to consider in the last decade the atrocities in Darfur and how those have affected how we consider the notions of whether we should impose democracy on countries or not. Now this is the doctrine to which we adhere. It's a doctrine formulated not by a Westerner, it's not a Western construction, but by a Sudanese, Dr. Francis Deng. A doctrine that counts amongst the greatest proponents, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. But for a moment I'm going to move to the area where perhaps the most controversy lies in this whole concept of imposition of values, the area looking at what I've just described before. In general, I want to make one thing quite clear, and I wonder whether the opposition will look at this as well. You cannot impose democracy by the barrel of a gun. It cannot be done. You cannot drop democracy on a country at 10,000 feet. That doesn't work. Democracy is a long and patient process, a build-up. It takes years, as we have discovered in our own history, as Europe has discovered, as America has discovered, as other countries have discovered over time. You need to build up institutions of civil society, of free press, of free media, of respect for rule of law, respect for minorities. These things do not happen overnight. Why am I mentioning this? Why am I launching a preemptive strike, perhaps, on the opposition's argument? Well, I'll tell you why. Because there's a common misconception internationally that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, perhaps controversial wars, were fought in the name of democracy. Absolute nonsense. They were fought for one thing alone: national security. Look back at the facts. We went to war in Afghanistan not to create a democracy in Afghanistan, not to impose democratic values on Afghanistan in that sense, but instead to respond to an attack on America by the Taliban regime's allies, Al-Qaeda. We went to war in Iraq, whether rightly or wrongly, because our leaders told us that there were weapons of mass destruction there that actually threatened our own national security. That was the excuse for war. Not one person stood up at the time and said, let's go to war to impose democracy on these countries. And I want to make this quite clear, because, as mentioned, we do not seek to look at imposing democracy by force, but we look at it as a long-term process, except in the case of responsibility to protect, where we have the option, we have the ability to intervene and to liberate people from genocide and acts of genocide. And rather than turning them over to yet another authoritarian regime, we have the opportunity at that point to impose a different set of values and to bring that to fruition. And I want, again, to make that distinction quite clear, quite available. So members of this esteemed union, the motion of this evening's debate would hold that this House believes that the West has a duty to impose democracy. It is our contention that democratic promotion abroad is a supremely worthy ambition, it's a worthy cause, and whose end is greater peace, not greater conflict, and a betterment of the human condition. I beg you to support this motion in order that those subjected to systematic persecution around the world might be afforded the opportunity to enjoy some of the freedom and prosperity that too many of us in the West sadly take for granted today. Thank you.